Several former members of the House January 6th Select Committee are pushing back against President-elect Trump's suggestion they should be jailed. Here's what Trump initially said on NBC's Meet the Press, followed by some of the reaction from former committee members.
Cheney was behind it, and so was Benny Thompson and everybody on that committee. For what they did, honestly, they should go to jail.
So you think Liz Cheney should go to jail?
For what they did.
Everyone on the committee, you think?
I think everybody anybody that voted in favor.
Are you going to direct your FBI director and your attorney general to send them to jail?
No, not at all. I think that they'll have to look at that, but I'm not going to. I'm going to focus on drill, baby, drill.
There's nothing we did as a January 6th Select Committee that violates the law. Just because you disagree with the work of the committee is no way to threaten those members of the committee with jail.
I don't think the incoming president should be threatening his political opponents with jail time. That's not the kind of talk we should hear from a president in a democracy. Nor do I think that a pardon is necessary for the members of the January 6th committee.
I did my job. I think the other committee members all feel that we did our job. We upheld the rule of law. We talked about the importance of peaceful transfer of power. We also highlighted everything that the former president did along the way to stop that and to prevent that, including threats to his own vice president.
Jonathan, I think your reporting, like my reporting, shows that people close to Donald Trump right now are saying he's not interested in retribution. He's just still sort of mouthing off because that's what he said on the campaign. He's not going to back down that quickly. That said, the threat is out there, and it's out there. And when you see these members talking, it shows you it's one thing to say something on a campaign trail to level those threats, those unconstitutional, illegal threats on a campaign trail or an interview as a punchline. It's quite another when these people are talking back to you and saying what we did was legal. And seriously, how does that, and this is the thing we need to keep asking, how does that end for Donald Trump when he tries to put Benny Thompson in jail, when he tries to put any of those members in jail, Adam Kinzinger in jail for doing their job, first of all, and not doing anything illegal?
Whatever agenda Trump wants to put forward or deals he wants to make would all be derailed if he were to do this. There's no sense of what crime they would be charged with, first and foremost. There would be certainly an uproar if he were to suddenly try to arrest journalists or lawmakers. Look, he has said, though, from day one, in his first major campaign speech, he said retribution is what he was running on. And we have learned we have to largely take him at his word. Yes, there are people in the Trump world who are saying, no, these are still just campaign promises. He has to mouth them. But we also know, Vaughn, that he has many times sort of bended the knee to his base. That he has taken, he's been afraid of their anger, and when he's promised something to them and they expect it, he has to say, look, I promised retribution. I promised these January 6th committee members would be arrested. What does he do? What does the base do if he doesn't follow through? And at the same time, I didn't hear any Republican lawmakers speaking out to defend their colleagues who've been threatened with arrest either.
No, and if you look at Kash Patel, if he in fact is able to take the helm at the FBI, Kash Patel knows exactly what Donald Trump wants because he's been campaigning on it for the last 2 years, even before he started running for office. It's kind of like on January 6th. Donald Trump wasn't necessarily right outside of the Capitol with his fist up in the air saying, go and attack. But everybody knew implicitly what Donald Trump wanted them to do that day, and that was to stop the certification of the vote. And so for all of these nominees that he is putting forward, from Pete Hegseth to Tulsi Gabbard, Donald Trump, for months now, has been putting on social media AI images of Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama, Liz Cheney in orange jumpsuits. He has called for the military tribunal of Barack Obama. He has called for the jailing of Jack Smith. So Donald Trump at this point, he doesn't really have to say much more. All he has to tell is Kristen Welker, they should be investigated. And that's exactly what his people are going to do because he's been telling them that that's exactly what he wants.
And that's the reason Kash Patel is there, because of the things he said on podcasts and other places. He's a guy who's going to carry out Donald Trump's retribution program. There is a complicating factor for Donald Trump, Rev, which is our judicial system. There has to be a charge. What are you charging Benny Thompson with? There are judges, there are juries who will listen to evidence, and this will go through a process if it actually happens. But this is another case like pardoning the January 6th convicted felons. Is he really going to open the jails and let people who beat up cops out into the streets? And what would be the implication? He's still trying to be president of the United States and run a country, and all that would hamper his ability to do it.
It would definitely hamper his ability, but you have to first start with that whoever Donald Trump nominates to be the district U.S. attorneys are people that usually have more of a background than some of those he's putting forth for his cabinet. And do you think people that have done 30, 40 years of service in the criminal justice arena wants to throw all of that away on some bogus indictments and bogus cases when the root of the accusation is that there was an attempted insurrection and stopping of the certification of an election? Let's not act like we're talking about something that didn't warrant a congressional investigation. We're talking about people that tried to literally overthrow an election or at least stall the certification of it. And to act like that is suspect, I think, is un-American. I mean, if the country stands for democracy, you're supposed to investigate those that tried to interfere with the democratic process.
Well, Candy is so short-sighted, too, for three reasons. It'd be bad for the country, it'd be bad for Congress, it'd be bad for Donald Trump for three reasons. First reason is it would get in the way of any legislation that anybody wanted to do, to get anything done, which he has said time and again. He wants to get a deal with Democrats on immigration. That's number one. Number two, it would actually draw attention back to January 6th. Now, as we got further and further away from January the 6th, people started believing, the
Day of Love
propaganda around January 6th that Donald Trump was pushing on the campaign trail. But at the time, 20 million people saw it. People were riveted by the testimony. People were deeply concerned by what happened. Donald Trump's poll numbers go down. I think the last thing you want to do is actually draw people's attention back there. And finally, the third thing is, if you arrest Liz Cheney, Benny Thompson, you name it, whomever, you make them political heroes. One of the reasons many people believe Donald Trump got reelected president of the United States was because he was sitting at a defendant's table all summer, and it made him a martyr. And so if he turns around and makes, let's say, Liz Cheney a martyr, he only makes her stronger, only makes her more powerful, and only makes it more likely that she's the next president of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the same reporting that you and Lemire have been hearing, which is that he doesn't actually want to go back. He doesn't want to put these people in jail, which makes it a little curious that he's appointed Kash Patel to lead the FBI, because I think Kash Patel is somebody that would like a campaign of retribution. There's a little bit at the end of that clip there that is getting less attention, and that is the drill baby drill bit. I think Donald Trump's, a lot of the executive orders that we see on day one and in the early days are actually going to be around business and rewarding his business cronies. This is going to be an extraordinary boom for oil and gas industry, for Donald Trump's billionaire friends. I mean, as one Republican put it to me, if they found there was oil under the Washington Monument, they would be drilling on the Washington Mall, and that there will be nothing off grounds. And I think that he doesn't necessarily want to have the distractions from that. He has his priorities on immigration, which I think will be the big social policy push. And then it's going to be a lot of business policy and a lot of M&A activity and a lot of deregulation, which will satisfy the very many billionaires who he's being advised by.